Today, experts, academics and celebrities, they're heading to the Senedd to present a new report on the NHS in Wales. So the report says that if the NHS is allowed to fail, so will the economy. And campaigners hope to influence the Welsh Government to prioritise NHS funding. The new First Minister, Vaughan Gething, saying the NHS is one of his top priorities just this week. Now, one of the celebrities involved with the report is the award-winning Welsh actor, Owen Teale. And I'm very pleased to say that he's joined us here in the studio this morning. Bore da, good morning.
Bore da, thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Why are you presenting this report to the Senedd this morning or later today, and how have you got involved?
I got involved because I became, and I think I probably speak for a lot of people here, increasingly negative and almost apathetic about what was happening to the NHS and seeing that there was no other way. That we're being told that it's unaffordable to continue as it is, that it needs to be fragmented and broken down into private and an insurance-based system like they have in America. And I've always felt rather deflated by that, coming from a time when it did so much for me and my family, and we took so much for granted, and particularly the life of my father, which was extended some 20-odd years by prompt action to do with his own colonic cancer, in a way that millions of people did benefit. And now the delays that are going on, the underfunding that causes that, is appalling. And is it necessary? So I was introduced to a man called Mark E. Thomas, who has indeed written this report, The Rational Policy Maker's Guide to the NHS, and in due course read it and felt very impassioned that maybe it isn't inevitable.
So summarise for us, if you will, what is the thrust of his argument?
Well, his argument is that when it started, the NHS, Clement Attlee and Aneurin Bevan, they set out, and the national debt was 200% of GDP. That's twice what it is today. And yet they had the political will, and maybe the country was in a more positive mood coming out of the Second World War that we'd all survived, and was willing to believe. And so they had enormous debt, but therefore, we were able to get an NHS, and the workforce benefited from that. And therefore, the economy, the very thing that has been prided above everything else, the thing that has been funded so much, the economy, in terms of when we had COVID, when we had the financial crisis. I mean, each of those, there was quantitative easing of 440 to 450 billion pounds given. Now, where did that money come from? So it was made. A government can make money. And so why can't they do that for the NHS in a much smaller way?
And there will be others who'll argue that, you need to keep a iron grip on the finances, otherwise you end up in a situation, as we saw with the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss. More broadly, do you think we're too wedded to the delivery of healthcare in the system, free at the point of need, the NHS? It's mythologised, and it's almost a part of the national psyche, when in fact some of the outcomes aren't great. And there are other systems. It doesn't have to be between Britain and America, which is, basically polar opposites. There are neighbouring countries in Europe who've got different systems and better outcomes.
Yes, at the moment, but in 2017, as recently as that, they weren't better outcomes. How has that happened? How come we've gone from number one, the gold standard? Around that time, 2016 to 2018, I worked in Canada, South Africa, Australia, and everywhere I worked, I had to sign up to have medical insurance. And so you become aware of the system and wherever you are. And it was always, the received idea was that ours was the gold standard. And I just don't understand how it's got to where we are now, where we're not. We've lost something, and that's why I feel passionate.
So are you saying give the NHS whatever it needs?
I think you can, because without it, the economy will fail. That where it's heading at the moment, the actual workforce will not be able to work. It will take some time, but that's the direction we're heading in. And this could be a pivotal moment. We don't realise it yet, but this could be a pivotal moment in the downfall of our NHS. Now, I don't know.
It's under huge pressure, isn't it? I mean,
it's under
not just in here in
enormous
Wales,
pressure,
but across the UK. It is reeling, quite frankly, after the pandemic and struggling to get back to a pre-pandemic situation, which itself wasn't great. Let's be honest. It's just far worse at the moment. And, you know, huge pressure on doctors and nurses.
Yes.
Many of them looking, quite frankly, to leave the NHS.
Well, indeed. And, you know, can you blame them? So what I'm saying is that the underfunding does not meet the need that is out there. So something is terribly wrong. Now, there's, as you said, there's a lot of school of thought that a lot of politicians are subscribing to, that the whole system has got to change. And I have to say, I was part of that group going along with it.
But you've got the Conservative Party in Westminster, you've got the Welsh Labour Party here, you know, all of the main parties, be they in Wales or Westminster, they are all fully signed up to an NHS free at the point of need.
They are, but there's a lot of talk of how it will go on into the future, even, I believe, from members of the Labour Party as well, that it will have to change. And
yeah, they're
and
talking more about
I thought I agreed
of
with
the
that.
way things are delivered, you know, in operating theatres, in A&E departments, rather than changing the principles behind it. Rather than changing, you know, the way that it's funded and the idea of an NHS free at the point of need. They're talking about the way it works on the ground in those operating theatres, in those A&E departments, needs to change. They basically saying there's not necessarily a blank check. Things might have to change in terms of
who are saying
matters.
that? What I mean is, who are saying that? You mean the actual clinical practitioners?
Well, you've got the Labour Party in Westminster saying that, for example. You've got others in the Conservative Party.
Well, that's right. They're saying, and I subscribe to that. I hadn't thought deeply enough about it, but when I read this, it's called the rational policymaker. Now, a rational policymaker, you know, in history has been someone that's not dealing in idealism, but dealing in realism. And Mark E. Thomas, who's written this, is very much, he's an economist, he's a professor of economics, and he is a very passionate man as well. So he does speak about idealism, yes. But in the report, there is the real nuts and bolts of how it can get there through more efficiency in basically in tax collecting. The amount of, you know, avoidance, let alone evasion, which is a criminal act, you know, that is slipping through, the billions that are being lost. And if that could be funneled, if they cared enough and funneled it towards the NHS, then the clinical people on the ground would not have to be doing managerial and administrative jobs at the same time. And in my recent, you know, ventures into the hospital system, not here in Wales, I haven't been here recently, but in London, to do with members of my family, has been that they're absolutely strung out because they're having to do both. That means there's not enough people, you know, and that's... So what are you going to do about it? I think they should give it a chance and really, really start writing big checks.
Owen Teale, thank you so much for joining us here in the
Thank you.
studio. You and others will be at the Senedd later today presenting the arguments made in this report
Yes,
about
indeed.
the future of the NHS. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.